Who Gets to Decide? A liberty-based podcast that brings a little piece of sanity to a confused society drowning in a culture of craziness. And here is your host, Seth Martin.
Well, all right. What's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Who Gets to Decide. This is episode 635. I'm Seth Martin, your host. Thank you for joining me this evening. Glad you're here and always happy you're listening. Today I want to talk about inequality. It's one of these things that persist in the public dialogue, and there's just a lot of, I hate to use this word, misinformation, but there is a lot of misinformation. It's not so much misinformation as we're going to see today, it's the lack of understanding of causality. And causality is a complicated thing for people because there's a lot of reasons. One, we're trying to explain things inside of a closed system that's very, very complicated. I mean, billions of variables, right? The economy is a very complex system. But the other reason causality is difficult to pinpoint is because a lot of people haven't been exposed to, sorry, I'm tangled up here, haven't been exposed to the truth around certain principles. And it's easier to explain these causal relationships if you understand the principles behind them, or it's easier to understand these causal relationships if you understand the principles behind them. And unfortunately, we have public schools, we have kind of this culture. I know when I was in college, some classes you were just not interested in, and you were just trying to get a decent grade and move on to another class that you were hopefully more interested in. And then politics kind of distorts things too, because the media has an interest in shaping political conversations a certain way. The government certainly has an interest, and every individual has an interest, but individuals don't have a voice in this complex body politic, right? What we've done is we've got agents supposedly working for us in the government. These are your congressmen, your senators, and this was the idea behind a government of, for, and by the people, right? You wouldn't have everybody vote on everything. But this also, when you have a big political kind of machine to fight over, there's a lot at stake for people to gain control of it. Okay, to control it, to use it against its enemies, to use it to advantage itself. And all this kind of stuff happens and ripples into the quote-unquote conversation. And the conversation is not so much misinformation as it is manipulation. And I wanted to play a very well-produced video. I'm not going to play the whole thing because it's very long, and as it is, I think I'm going to skip through some sections. But this young woman does a pretty good job. She obviously knows how to put together video, and she does connect the history part really well, but she assigns causality in ways that don't make sense. And I'm going to stop at those areas, and I'm going to point out what's wrong about what she's saying, and I'm going to hopefully explain to you the correct way to think about this, and at least the correct way as far as I understand it. And I've read, several dozen economic books. I mean, this is something that interests me, okay? If you haven't figured that out. I'm interested in economics. I'm interested in the linchpin, the thing that explains the craziness in our society. We talked about that in the last show. You've got the Epstein situation, which I think explains some craziness. And now you got this voting source code thing, this Venezuela source code that allows powerful people to get control of the election system and elect people that are ideologically aligned with themselves and change our society, change it in a way that you and I individually don't want to see it changed. And so in some ways our sovereignty, our individual sovereignty is under attack by these mechanisms, some of it is state related, some of it is just the fallout from state actors, like the government just tends to have, because it takes in so much money and it wants to spend so much money, it tends to, as a part of that, create a bunch of nefarious stuff that we don't want. And all this kind of just works on your individual sovereignty and takes away our liberty and makes our standard of living lower and makes it feel like our lives are harder to manage. And this is what this woman's show is about. Why is life so difficult? Okay. But she misses the mark in several areas, and I want to take this opportunity to do a takedown. I'm using air fingers quotes. It's not really a takedown, but just in some parts she's spot on. She's spot on with the history and everything, but she assigns causality in a way that's just incoherent, and I definitely want to point that out. So let's go ahead and start her video. She kind of covers the big picture here with a friend of hers. And right after she's done with that, I'm going to stop and talk about the big picture from my perspective as well. All right, here we go.
Something has been happening in the global economy. Everyone seems to be talking about it. We've all been hearing that wealth inequality has been massively rising over the last couple of decades. But there's something that I didn't quite understand. How did wealth inequality get this extreme? And I couldn't stop thinking about it. I got obsessed, trying to understand everything. Researching interest rates, legislation, tax rates, and the exact mechanisms that enabled this massive shift in wealth distribution. One of the first things I did was visit one of my friends, someone who's been researching wealth inequality for over a decade.
So, how come everything's so fucked right now? How come wealth inequality has become this bad?
Yeah, so that is a very good question. So my work has largely been on understanding how wealth inequality affects our economy. And I've been working on that for about 15 years. And in that time, wealth inequality has gotten a lot worse. And I think it's driving a lot of our economic problems. But I would actually like to know a little bit more about how wealth inequality started to increase. So the big picture historical story, from my understanding, is wealth inequality was really very, very bad for most of history in Europe, in the West. And then we have this period starting in World War II, really, where wealth inequality reduces significantly. And with that, we get the rise of the middle class and the big increase in broad living standards that probably our parents lived in. And then we start to see that change.
Test.
And the obvious time to look at would be the late 70s, early 80s, when we see the beginning of the Thatcher government here in the UK and the Reagan government in the US, who really radically reduced taxes for the top end. So in that post-war period, you had these like 95% top rates of income and inheritance tax, which kept inequality low. And then when Thatcher and Reagan come in, they really aggressively reduce those taxes. And I think that is when you start to see the wealth of the very rich start to grow. Before that, it's not really possible. But what I'm interested in and what I'd like to know a little bit more about is basically how that became possible and also why they did it. Like basically, what were Thatcher and Reagan thinking when they decided to radically reduce tax on the very rich? And why did the public allow it? You should make a video about it.
So, I did. But
Okay, first of all, I want to say all that is true. The history that they gave there is true. But I want you guys to think about something. I want you to think about how does taxing or the lack of taxing, let me say it this way. If you're taxed a certain rate, okay, and the government taxes you less, okay, whatever the government was taking from you before is yours. Okay, it's your money. And so it doesn't matter. This whole idea between rich and, middle class and all this, it doesn't matter. When the government takes money from you, they're taking some of your economic power. Okay? And that action has nothing to do with classes. Okay? There's no class struggle there. This is a socialist, a communist, a collectivist idea that somehow the tax system itself is very socialist. Okay, a progressive tax system is socialist in nature. And so his argument is that making it less socialist, making it less progressive, the fairest tax system would be everybody pay 10%. Whether you make $1 billion a year or you make $10,000 a year, everybody just pay 10%. That's the fairest system. Okay? But whether somebody has $1 million and is taxed 10% versus me having $100,000, let's say I'm being taxed 10%, that has no bearing on my ability to accrue wealth, to save, to things like this. Okay? Taxing does not create, now it creates less economic activity, okay? But it doesn't create inequality, okay? That inequality is already there. If somebody has the ability to make $1 million a year and somebody else only has the ability to make $100,000 a year, the inequality is already there. Whether you raise or reduce each other's taxes within that range of ability to earn income, that doesn't matter, okay? So this is just an incoherent way of thinking that somehow lowering tax rates creates inequality. There's no evidence of that. There's actually a more coherent explanation for what creates inequality. And it has to do with the banking system. It has to do with the diminishment of the value of the money. Now, what is in another area of inequality is financial sophistication between groups. So people that make $1 million a year or $100 million a year, they tend to be more financially sophisticated than people that make $30,000 a year or even $100,000 a year. And that inequality is just it's not anything the government creates per se. It's a lack of knowledge. And of course, knowledge is everybody's own responsibility. Everybody has their own responsibility for gaining knowledge. And some people gain enough knowledge to manage their life the way they want to, and that's it. That's all the knowledge they want to gain, and they're out. And that's fine. That's freedom. That's liberty. But that knowledge, in conjunction with the way the economy, and we're going to get into this later, where she talks about Bretton Woods, and then we talk about the failure of the Bretton Woods system. Once that started to roll in that direction, and the dollar started to lose value against this $35 standard that we set during Bretton Woods, then that level of knowledge, of sophistication, of what to do, that created the inequality. Okay, so for example, as the dollar loses value, if I'm a sophisticated financial person, I might recognize that, oh, if I borrow money to collect assets, that'll benefit me because assets are very price sensitive to the devaluing of the dollar. And so I might start buying assets at that point. It could be stocks, it could be businesses, it could be whatever. And so to the extent somebody's more financially sophisticated, they may do more of that. They may go to the banking system and borrow more money and start to collect assets. But notice that has nothing to do with taxing. Now, maybe you have a little bit more money set aside that you can put down on anything you borrow from the bank. That's true. But taxing per se doesn't have anything to do with that piece of the inequality, okay? I don't know if I'm making myself clear. I think it'll be clear in a minute when they start talking about Bretton Woods. But she's going to start after World War II. She's going to talk about how the entire world was destroyed and the productive capacity of the entire world lay in the United States, which is all true. And we all got together and said, hey, why don't we just use the dollar? That way we don't have to ship all this gold around. And it sounds really good. The difference, the problem is it relied heavily on trust of the U.S. government. And she points out that as long as the U.S. government was exporting a lot, then that trust was, people pretty much trusted the U.S. government. But we'll just pick it back up there. But let me jump back into her story because it is a good chronological history of what has happened here in the United States. It's just the causality that they assign to inequality is all wrong. And I'll talk more about that in a minute.
Before we talk about history or ideology or politicians, we need to start with something a lot more simple. Let's start with the obvious question. What is actually happening? How has life become so expensive, so stressful for so many people? The data tells a story you might be familiar with, but I'm still going to mention it to illustrate the magnitude of the...
Let me stop right there for just a second. She says she makes this statement that the data tells the story. That actually is not true. The data, I can present data 15 different ways and put a story around it and convince you of anything, okay? Data by itself does not tell a story, okay? Data in the framework of a set of principles, a set of understanding about how things work, that tells a story. Data by itself does not tell a story. So there are a lot of people that will point to some correlation in data and then assign causality to that. But there's a famous saying in economics, correlation is not causation. You can always find something that correlates to something else. You see this a lot with the climate change people. They're always finding things that correlate to climate change. U.S. production of steel is going up, or oil and gas production, or more people driving on the road, and therefore temperatures are climbing. But what they don't ever talk to you about is this giant ball of fire out in outer space that shines light on the earth. Might that have something to do with rising temperatures or something? They just leave that out. So in other words, understanding causality has a lot more to do with than just finding some data that correlates to your story. Okay, that's just a fallacy. So I just want to interject that before I forget, because it irritates me that people do this all the time, and it's used. Now, I don't think this woman is intentionally manipulating us. I don't think that's her intention. I think she's trying to tell a story. I mean, she's a young Gen Zer or whatever, and the economy is very difficult for this group of people, and they're trying to understand why. They're groping around for answers because the people on Fox News or the people in the government are not giving us answers that make sense. And so, they're blaming somebody, or they're blaming Russia, or, something like that. And that's supposed to explain inequality and why I can't make my life work. But that's not doing it for people. And so you got young people like this woman trying to put her finger on what the hell is going on, right? It's just that there's a lack of knowledge about how an economy works. People think that, for example, the economy, The only reason the economy works is because the government is there, supposedly calling balls and strikes. And that's why the economy works. But I can tell you that if we had no government at all, there were no governments anywhere in the world, there would be an economy and there would be people trading. Now, they wouldn't be trading in dollars. They might be trading in gold or silver or seashells or something like that. I mean, history tells us they would be trading in gold. But there's no necessity for government in an economy. An economy, a market, is just free people producing what they have the ability to produce and trading it with other people that have the free ability to produce something. And to the extent you can produce more than you need, like if you have a garden, like one year I was living with my grandparents and they had a garden and we had 176 tomato plants in it. Don't ask me why I can remember this, but every day we had 2 5-gallon buckets of tomatoes. We couldn't eat 2 5-gallon buckets of tomatoes. So what we did is we'd gather up the 2 buckets of tomatoes. We would take out the ones we want, put them in the refrigerator, and then we would drive down the street and trade some tomatoes for new potatoes or for peas or for asparagus or I'm trying to think of something. I can't think of the vegetable, but we would trade things. There were neighbors that grew other things, and so we would trade. And then the next day we'd have 2 new 5-gallon buckets of tomatoes. I mean, you just couldn't eat all that you produced. So what people learned how to do is to trade their excess, and that's how a market works. You don't need a government to do that. There was nobody from the local government coming to my grandparents' house going, okay, you guys get out there and pick 2 5-gallon buckets, and then you go down to the Smith's house and the George's house and trade all that away. There was none of that. It was just organic, okay? And this is the way markets work. You don't actually need a Federal Reserve. You don't actually need a Treasury, okay? These are government creations for the purpose of government type things, okay? And they steal from us and steal from our productivity and our production in order so that they can survive for their own means and their own ends. And so, a lot of people just kind of see the world and markets through government, but that's an improper way to think about it. And this girl's as guilty as the next person. All right, let's continue.
Wealth inequality we're seeing today. Let's start with the big picture. The top 1% now own more than the bottom 95% of society, and the wealth gap is widening.
Well, the holidays have come and gone once again, but if you've forgotten to get that special someone in your life a gift, well, Mint Mobile.
And this isn't happening slowly, it's happening violently. Since 1979, worker productivity has kept rising.
Okay, let me stop here. And sorry about the Mint Mobile app ad. Mint Mobile should send me some money for playing it. But anyway, this graph, she's right. Inequality is happening. Okay, so the question is why? And then she pulls up this graph. Now I just want to point out that top line is worker productivity. And then the bars at the bottom are real wages. And I've shared this graph with you guys before. In fact, I have a video that I'll put in the show notes page that it talks about 3 graphs that I refer to constantly. But notice where she takes the causality. Okay, I'm going to tell you that she talks about 1979, which is right in here, where wages flattened. But notice they peaked. Where they peaked is right there around 1970, 1971. And they went down, and then they rallied a little bit, and then they went down and then flattened out. And so she kind of starts history at 1979. And what I'm telling you is, no, you need to start history in August of 1971. And she does point that out later in the show. She talks about the end of the Bretton Woods system. But again, she assigns the wrong causality. She talks about the end of the Bretton Woods system being a function of a trade surplus in the United States. And that's not accurate, what she says. So let's continue and get her point of view so that we can take her on point by point here.
But wages flatlined. This is the moment the economy stopped rewarding labour and started rewarding ownership. Why CEO pay skyrocketed, worker pay stayed low, and house prices and the cost of living grew exorbitantly.
So why is worker pay not rewarded, but ownership is rewarded? Let's think about that for a second. So let me just give you an example. Let's say you're an employee of a company, okay? And you make $75,000 a year. Some of you are probably going, God, I wish I made $75,000 a year. And some of you are saying, God, there's no way I could live on $75,000 a year. I think that's about the median income, so that's why I used it. But let's say that you're working at a company and you're making $75,000 a year. And your company makes something. It doesn't matter what it makes. It makes steel buildings, okay? Well, what happens is on the input side of your company's business, you have steel products. Maybe you've got the roofing, corrugated roofing material, you got beams, you got concrete, you got various other things. These are inputs into that business, that manufacturing business, okay? And what happens when the business tries to make a certain amount of margin, right? Now they're limited because they have competitors, so they can only make so much margin. Maybe that margin is 25%, let's say, gross margin. Net margin after taxes and stuff like that might be closer to 4%, 5%. But gross margin, let's say, is 25%. And the COO of the company, is watching the numbers very carefully and starts to see that input prices of this steel is going up, okay? Boom, immediately a memo goes out. Hey, we need to raise our prices a little bit. We're starting to see increases on the order of 3 to 5%. Let's raise our prices 4%, okay? Immediately, starting some date, the new price of a steel building goes up 4%. Now, you're an employee there, okay? You're an employee, and when do you get a raise? Do you get a raise immediately? As soon as steel prices go up, you get a raise too? No. That's not how that works. You get to wait till the end of the year, and you have a meeting with your manager, and you have certain things that you were supposed to do over the course of the year, and maybe you did them, maybe you didn't, and your manager says, you know what? You did a good job this year. We're going to raise your pay 2%. Okay? Now, part of what drives this is your ability to leave and go work somewhere else and things like that. But they manage all that very carefully. Okay? But you're an input cost too, so they don't want to they've already had to raise their prices because the steel cost. They don't want to have to raise their prices again because of your increased cost. So they shorten your pay increase a little bit. So here's the business gets to immediately raise its prices when the input prices go up, but your price input or your income input into you maybe lags that by a whole year. Okay, so this is kind of how it works. And sometimes it's even worse than that because let's say you're losing more and more business somewhere and maybe they can't raise your pay so much. And so they have to roll the dice that you are not going to leave. And maybe you do leave. But the point is productivity continues to go up because businesses can raise their prices. They see their input costs going up. They raise their prices. Productivity, the value of your labor inside that business effectively went up. Okay. But it just didn't come back to you. It went to the owners of the business. And this is a monetary phenomenon, okay? There is no real reason prices should ever go up. Now, she talks about the oil embargo of the 70s, and that's a different kind of price issue, okay? That's not the same. That's not a monetary phenomenon. We're going to talk about that, but it's related to a monetary phenomenon, but the way she describes it is kind of accurate. Oil prices went up, and because oil's in everything, all these prices went up. That's true. But the question then is, why did oil prices go up? There's two reasons. One, the OPEC kind of created a shortage, like a man-made created shortage. But then also the dollar. They didn't like the fact that the dollar was being inflated away, and so this kind of was related to the problem as well. But the bigger problem with productivity is a monetary problem. It doesn't have anything to do with oil. But notice that when she talks about this problem, she's going to talk about taxes. She's going to talk about politics. She's going to talk about the wealthy, owned assets, that's just the right thing to do if the government is destroying your currency. Own things that have real value. So own a business, own land, own gold, own something that will hold its value in the face of the government printing more money. Okay, that's just what you do if your government is debauching the currency.
Making life unaffordable for a lot of people. So the question isn't, why is life so hard? The question is, what the fuck actually happened?
There are a few obvious mechanisms making this worse. Taxes for the wealthy collapsed, corporations barely paying taxes, capital gains, so profits you make on the stock market or through other investments, are taxed less than labour, workers losing bargaining power because unions aren't really a thing anymore, or stock buybacks which funnel profit to shareholders.
Okay, look, I could take these one at a time and show you that the causality has nothing to do with inequality. Okay? Each one of these, none of these have anything to do with inequality. Most of these are taxes, and we've already covered that. The taxes don't drive inequality. What drives inequality is money, fiat money, or dishonest money. Okay? The undermining of the value of the money that's in your pocket because the government has a printing press, effectively. Okay? That's the way we talk about it. It's not exactly, they don't actually sit there and run a printing press, but effectively that's what's happening. They're increasing the number of dollars in circulation, which devalue the dollars that you have in your pocket or in your bank account or in your home or in your car or whatever. Okay? Your car's worth more because it takes now there's more dollars circulating in the economy. So now your car, a real thing, demands more dollars to pay for it. Or your house, a real thing that sits on land, which cannot be created out of nothing. Okay, land is fixed. The land on earth is fixed. There's no way to create additional land on earth. But there is a way to create additional dollars, okay, in circulation. And this is a monetary effect. And this drives inequality. And what exacerbates it further is some people, some smart people, knew early on that, I can advantage myself by borrowing dollars. See, what happens when your currency is going down in value, what that means effectively is I can borrow money today and spend it, okay, and pay it back with dollars that buy less in the future. So effectively, that's like a shorting the dollar. It's like you saying, well, the dollars in the future are going to be worth less, so I'll borrow dollars today and spend it today, and I'll pay back the banks later with money that buys less in the economy. And that's a smart thing to do if your government is destroying the currency, which our government is. But that's what drives inequality, okay? Not taxes. Taxes are just ever present. And sometimes they go up and sometimes they go down. And sometimes capital gains go up and sometimes they go down. I don't think we should be taxing labor at all. I don't think we should be taxing anything, for that matter. I think we should have a tariff, a 10% tariff on everything that comes into the United States. And that's it, period. End of story, full stop. And the government just has to figure out how to get by with 10% on tariffs coming into the United States. Now, of course, the individual states can tax their citizens. They have the right to do that. But I'm talking about federal income tax. And that's what all these people are talking about, too. When they talk about taxes, they're talking about your federal income tax, the one that everybody pays. All right, let's get back into this.
Of course, it is super easy to just read out this list and say, oh, it's because of this. But listing this out doesn't really explain how this happened and the history and mechanisms that made it possible. Because this didn't happen by accident. It was caused deliberately by decisions made at a very specific moment in history. So in this video, we're diving deep into the history, starting after World War II. After World War II, the world was in chaos. Europe was destroyed, Japan was destroyed, and the global economy was basically lying face down in the mud. So everyone kind of came together at the Bretton Woods Conference. And by everyone, I mean 730 delegates from 44 allied nations, with the United States and the United Kingdom playing lead roles. Germany and Japan, aka the losers, were not invited for obvious reasons. The people who came together at Bretton Woods wanted to avoid the catastrophic conditions that had threatened the world order and democracy during the 1930s, the Great Depression, which was a major contributing factor to World War II.
Okay, this is an interesting thing. She mentions, we want to avoid the 1920s and 30s where, there was a Great Depression and all. But the same thing I'm talking about created that. Okay? World War I. So what, just real quick, in World War I, anytime you have a war, there's massive amounts of spending, okay? And there's also kind of a rejiggering of the economy. Tanks are made, guns are made, less consumer goods are made, and more wartime goods are made, okay? But it all costs money, and the government is spending the money. Well, the government doesn't have anything. And it sent all the workers off to war, so there's nobody to tax, okay? So what does the government do? It starts to borrow money. Well, if I've got, 10,000, 100,000 tons of gold in my vault, then I can spend money up to a certain amount. But what happened in the West, all the banks started to loan governments money in excess of what they had in their vaults. And so this devalued all the currencies. This is why the British pound went from, what was it, 425 pounds sterling to an ounce of silver or something to $13 or 13 pounds or something. I mean, it was crazy, and this destroyed the economies of Europe. Okay, and it especially destroyed Germany because Germany got blamed for the whole war. So Germany's Weimar Republic, they just printed up the money. They just printed the money they need. Well, that just made things worse for Germany. And, actually, obviously there was a currency collapse. But notice that she's kind of using what happened in the 1930s as, again, causality for why we want to create this new system where everything's pegged to the dollar so we can avoid that. But we don't actually avoid it, is the problem. It's just instead of see what happens when you have massive inflation, and then that creates, like she says later on here, she talks about production goes down and layoffs happen and all this stuff. Then what follows is massive deflation. Okay, you don't always have inflation first. Sometimes you can have deflation first and then inflation, but they always come together. One comes first and then another one happens. But it can be different depending on the circumstances. But what created the inflation that led to the depression was the same kind of scheme. Hey, let's not use gold as money because, it's hard to ship around and you have to store it and people have to carry coins around in their pocket. I mean, these are all, maybe they're good reasons, but from the government's perspective, those are reasons they're giving because they want to steal from the public, okay? And they did steal from the public. At first they started, she says that it worked as long as America had a surplus. But the reason the Bretton Woods system broke down was not because America no longer could keep a surplus. It broke down because the government printed money beyond what it had in gold and decided to end that convertibility. Anyway, I'm getting the cart before the horse here. So let's continue here with what she's talking about.
The Great Depression basically nuked the global economy and basically pushed half the world into fascism. Also, if you want to know more about the Great Depression and what caused it, I talk a lot more about it in this video. Anyways, the point is, as we can see today, if people don't have enough resources and cost of living keeps going up, what do people do? They turn to political extremism and start blaming minorities like immigrants and foreigners, trans people, or in case of pre-World War II Germans, the Jews. Anyways, the people at Bretton Woods, under the leadership of US...
It's interesting how she just kind of leaves you hanging. She says, oh, when these things happen, they start blaming minorities and poor people and blah. No, who's they, first of all? Governments do that, and they kind of stir the media up to do that. Yeah, I mean, when things aren't going their way, they want to blame somebody. But notice that the whole cause of this whole disaster was the governments in the first place. The governments are the ones that decided to go to war. The governments are the ones that decided to borrow so much money from the banks that then led to massive inflation, which led to a collapse in asset prices, which led to a wave of defaults, which led to the Great Depression. Okay? This is all created by government. None of this stuff has to happen in a normal economy. Okay? This is all... Now they'll tell you that we got to do all this to make sure we don't have another depression, or to make sure. But the truth is, none of this would happen in the first place if the governments weren't interfering in the economy by disrupting the value of the money, regulating things, creating financial repression, all these things that governments do to try to control the situation so they can go prosecute their war, or they can put sanctions on somebody, or whatever. Okay, this is the narrative, okay? But we learn in school, that this is the causality. What caused this was World War I caused this. Like, okay, yeah, war caused it, but the reason the war caused it is because the governments borrowed so much money, so much more money than they actually had in gold. That led to a massive run-up in asset prices. Eventually that collapsed. Just like, look, way back in the 1400s, there was a tulip mania. I don't know if you've ever heard of this. Maybe I'll put a link in the show notes page for the tulip mania. But people were borrowing against tulips. Can you imagine? And the value of tulips increased like 400 or 4,000% over a pretty short period of time. Well, then what happened one day? Somebody walked in and goes, tulips? Why are you guys? You're putting up. I mean, people were putting up tulips as to back a loan to buy a house. Now, can you imagine? Is that the dumbest thing you've ever heard? But that actually happened. Okay. Well, money, these things happen with fiat money too. People imagine that, if I print up a bunch of money, then that's money. And yeah, to the extent somebody's accepting it as money, yes, I guess it is money. But the reason governments have legal tender laws and things like that is so they can control it. Okay? They want to be able to control it. Why? Because they don't have anything. And they need to be able to control the money in order to get what they need from the economy to go fight wars and influence other countries and pay people off and do all the nefarious things governments do. All right. Sorry, I'm ranting a little bit.
Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. and the British economist John Maynard Keynes wanted to prevent this to happen again. So they designed a global economic system that would hopefully prevent another Great Depression. So all of these countries signed the Bretton Woods Agreement. The most important part of it was that they wanted to provide stability for international trade and investment. And they did that by establishing a fixed exchange rate system where each country's currency was pegged to the US dollar, which itself was convertible to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. The deal was simple. The US guaranteed that an ounce of gold was worth $35. This way, every other currency could safely anchor itself to the dollar, which was obviously way easier to enable trade because it was just massively impractical to send boatloads full of gold across the Atlantic Ocean every time you did a bigger trade. That is what made the dollar the world's financial center of gravity. This became the central point of the Bretton Woods system. What also happened during the Bretton Woods conference is that global financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank were created. The important part now is that you remember the fixed exchange rates. And the Bretton Woods system actually worked pretty well. From about 1945 until the early 1970s, life was good. So good that economists now call this period the golden age of capitalism. Economic growth was high because all the factories that had been producing bullets and tanks during the World War were now being used to produce stuff like washing machines. Unemployment was low. Housing was affordable. So affordable that it only took about 2 yearly average salaries to buy a house. Inequality was low because labour unions were strong. This was the era where a single income could support an entire family. And it wasn't the free market creating this stability. It was the opposite. A tightly regulated global economic system designed to keep chaos out.
Wrong. That is wrong, okay? Regulation does not create prosperity, period. Full stop. Labor unions do not create prosperity. Labor union is just a smaller version of government inside a company, okay? All it does is create friction. It creates I don't know, I'm not going to get into it today, but these labor unions got way out of control with work rules. And, you know, if you're standing there, let's say you're there to sweep the floor, but somebody needs you to pick up a box and move it across the room. Well, I can't do that because that's not in my contract. And this created tons of problems for businesses. Now, a lot of that was overcome initially because for this other reason that she mentions, we basically owned the production of the world. So we were making so much that it didn't matter. Nobody was really focused on it. But in a competitive environment, this would have killed us. And it ultimately did kill us because there was too much friction between labor and management. And these companies became inflexible and they couldn't keep their quality up and they couldn't manage their businesses. So labor unions weren't the cause of prosperity. There was prosperity in spite of labor unions. And we know that today because labor unions have been in decline ever since. Labor unions and productivity almost have nothing to do with one another. They're kind of a correlation, okay? They don't really have anything to do with one another. But she's right that things were very prosperous. And, you know, look, if you create a new system and you say, okay, we're going to have convertibility to gold with the dollar. That means that in 1960, I could have walked into a bank with $35 US dollars, put it on the table, and, well, it doesn't actually mean that because the convertibility to gold was actually through businesses or through countries rather. So let's say Mexico came and said, okay, here's $35 million. So that means what the United States would have given Mexico 1 million ounces of gold. Okay. And as long as that was being done, then productivity was high, people's standard of living was high, what they could buy with the money they got from their labor was high. What happened was we basically shut that down. We said, oh, we can't do that anymore. Mexico, you got $35 million. Sorry, we can't give you any gold. Well, then the race was on to see how much more money we could create. Okay. Anyway, I got off on a tangent there a little bit, but let's continue her talk.
Exchange rates were fixed,
banks were pretty regulated, corporations couldn't just yeet money into offshore accounts, and unions kept wages tied to productivity. And
why would you ship money into offshore accounts? There was no need to hide it. You were making lots of money. The companies were very productive. They were making good products and services and shipping them to the world. There's no reason to hide any money in offshore banking accounts. Corruption was fairly low at that time. We were a very cohesive society at that time. So not a lot of corruption, not a lot of graft. I mean, even at the political level, there was not a lot of that going on. Not as much as there's like an order of magnitude more going on today. So people didn't hide their money in offshore bank accounts. A lot of it was just not necessary at the time. That's why it didn't happen.
Worked really well for about 25 years. But the system had one fatal flaw. It only worked as long as the United States remained the global economic anchor. For the system to work, the United States had to keep running a trade surplus, meaning as long as the US exported more than it imported, everything was fine.
That is false. Not true. Okay? We could have gone to parity with the world. We could have imported just as much as we exported and have a zero trade balance or trade surplus. That is not what caused the Bretton Woods systems to fail. What caused the Bretton Woods system to fail is too much government spending. Spending beyond what people believed that we had in gold to back. And they didn't trust the U.S. government anymore. So they started sending pallets of dollars back to the U.S. government saying, send us our gold, please. Put your money where your mouth is, kind of thing. And this is what ended the Bretton Woods system. Not the fact that we could no longer have a surplus. I mean, it would be better if the U.S. had a surplus, but that is not what ended the Bretton Woods system. It was simply a function of too much spending beyond what we had in gold to back.
More stuff was leaving US factories than stuff coming into the US.
But in the 1960s, things started to change. The US was bleeding money into the Vietnam War, and Japan and Germany had rebuilt faster than expected and were producing cheaper and better goods than the US.
So the US began importing more than it exported, which meant the US stopped running a surplus and started running a trade deficit. This was a massive problem because the Bretton Woods system only worked if the US ran a surplus. The dollar became...
Not true. That is just not true. What she's saying is false. It has nothing to do with trade surplus or deficit. Now, your economy might not be as vibrant, okay, if you're running trade deficits, and maybe you can't run trade deficits forever in an honest money system, but that has nothing to do with why Bretton Woods broke down. It has absolutely nothing to do. And this is what I'm talking about. This becomes the storyline. And for all, I don't know where this woman learned this, but, people are writing books about things. There's things being taught in schools. You got to remember the governments run the schools. And so people are not necessarily learning the correct things. And so this whole causality map about why things are the way they are is a real problem. And, I've talked about this analogy before, but like in engineering, if you want to solve a problem, you first have to identify the correct problem. And this is a massive misidentification of the problem. And this is what leads people to think, oh, we're not taxing the rich enough. And, oh, we need to have tariffs and things like this. This is what leads them to think these things. And these cause even more problems. And so, I don't know. And then I was just talking to my wife today about this, about how people don't understand these things. But they also get to vote, which is a real problem. They can vote these bad ideas into action and individually, we have to suffer with the consequences.
Overextended, which means there were more dollars circulating globally than the US had gold to back them.
Let me stop right here and go to the next clip because there was a commercial that came up and I had to switch the clip. So
Running a trade deficit. This was a massive problem because the Bretton Woods system only worked if the US ran a surplus. The dollar became overextended, which means there were more dollars circulating globally than the US had gold to back them.
So she gets that right, but notice she doesn't connect that to trade surpluses or trade deficits. So that's right. What she just said is correct. There are more dollars in circulation than the US had in gold to back. That's what ended the Bretton Woods system right there, what she just said. It has nothing to do with trade surpluses or trade deficits. Again, I don't know why she said that earlier. She seems to have identified the correct thing here. Let's continue to listen here.
Foreign governments started losing confidence in the dollar and wanted to redeem their dollars for gold. And the US simply didn't have enough gold to give to them.
I know this is kind of complicated, but for now it's just important for you to know that the Bretton Woods system didn't really work anymore. So on the 15th of August 1971, Nixon ended the gold convertibility of the dollar.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve asset.
This detonated the entire Bretton Woods system.
Within a year, all the currencies had unpegged themselves from the dollar and floated freely, and everything kind of went to shit in the 70s. In 1973 and again in 1979, oil prices suddenly quadrupled overnight after geopolitical crisis in the Middle East.
Okay, oil prices going up have everything to do with the non-convertibility of the dollar to gold. Okay, those are related. Now, this gets a little bit more complicated, and we're not going to get into it, but the oil embargo of the early 70s was related to the non-convertibility of the dollar to gold. That's part of it. But then the other part of it is OPEC, it imposed upon itself a shortage. It basically said, they got together and said, instead of producing, I'm just going to make up another, 1 billion barrels of oil a day, we're only going to produce 500 million barrels of oil a day. And then people got out their calculators, they did some quick math, and they were like, oh shit, that means oil has to go up fourfold. And then, of course, as she says, oil's in everything. And so that created price increases. But it's related to the monetary problem, okay? Anytime, look, you might hear me say on this show sometimes that government interventions create distortions in the free market. And so if you suspend the convertibility of gold, that is a massive intervention into the market. You take a bunch of people that are used to trading where the dollar can be converted into gold, and so that anchors the dollar to some, discipline or reality. And then one day you end that creates massive corrections in all kinds of different markets, dislocations that kind of like an earthquake. You know how an earthquake, the faults, there's pressure, and then bam, they slip. That's what happens in an earthquake. That's what happened in the economy globally. The government just basically came out one day like, yeah, we're not sending you any more gold, sorry. And this created a huge problem. And oil being, one of the most used commodities in the global economy was certainly impacted by this. And OPEC responded by saying, we're not going to sell you oil for those shitty little dollars you printing up over there. And so that caused the price to, spike. And so even though these are separate kind of problems. They are related to one another. But OPEC also is a cartel that kind of sets prices and production levels, and that has a huge impact on what the price of oil is. Not so much today because the U.S. is producing more and there's other countries producing more, but in the 70s, the U.S. was producing oil, and the only other people producing oil were basically the Saudis, or, not the Saudis, but the OPEC nations. And so, yeah, there's going to be some issues there. When you create an intervention like that, you're going to have some dislocations and some ripple effects due to that.
East, sending inflation through the roof and plunging the global economy into chaos. Let me explain this.
When the price of oil quadrupled overnight, the cost of producing almost everything increased.
Oil isn't just something you put in your car. The entire modern economy depends on it.
The whole logistics and transport sector, all the factories, heating, agriculture, transport. And then there's everything made from oil. Polyester t-shirts, toothbrushes, shampoo bottles, packaging, plastic water bottles, car interiors, toys, medical gear. In short, everything.
So when the oil price quadrupled, everything else became a lot more expensive. And when everything gets more expensive, that's called inflation.
Production also became a lot more.
Actually, inflation is just the increase in the money supply or credit in the economy. That's all inflation is. Inflation technically is not a price phenomenon. It's a monetary phenomenon. And so when she says the price of everything went up and that's called inflation, that is actually incorrect. And this is another problem. People assign words to certain meanings that are not accurate, and that confuses people about the causality and things like that. Now, there are, when you start talking about price inflation, that's a very specific thing, price inflation. That is after there's monetary inflation, the economy usually, producers in the economy usually respond to that by increasing prices, and that's called price inflation. And when you get into the subject of price inflation, there's different kinds, like what they call cost push inflation, which is like rising oil prices, or I forgot the different types, but basically there are major commodities in the market that if their production is impacted significantly, it can have a positive or negative effect on prices. But that's different than monetary inflation. Monetary inflation is simply the increasing of the number of little units floating around, either in physical money or in bank credit. Okay, that's what inflation is. That's the definition. So again, using the wrong terms, confusing people, whether it's on purpose or not, I don't know, but this creates challenges when people are talking about things because they can talk past each other and not talk about the same thing.
More expensive, and people could afford less things. So companies produced less and had to lay off workers.
So unemployment skyrocketed and economic growth stagnated across most advanced capitalist economies.
The oil shocks, accelerating inflation, stagnating economic growth, and rising unemployment across most advanced capitalist economies all combined into an economic nightmare. Stagflation.
Need to find the best way to learn math? It's Brilliant.org. Brilliant's an effective and fun way to learn, built for the way your mind.
And while ordinary people were dealing with everything becoming more expensive and getting laid off and just overall economic chaos, there was another group watching the 1970s very closely. Business elites. Because something had been happening quietly since the 1940s. Something they really did not like. Their share of national income had been falling for decades.
During the Golden Age, workers got a bigger slice of the pie.
And wealth inequality had been shrinking. The richest people in society were, frankly, getting slightly less rich relative to everyone else.
And during the golden age, where the economy was booming, elites didn't really mind, because while their slice was slightly shrinking relative to the whole pie, the pie itself was growing so massively that they were still getting massively richer every year.
But that changed when the pie stopped massively expanding year after year.
Suddenly, the size of business elite's slice mattered again a lot.
Okay, this sounds a lot like an opinion to me, but I would say about what she's talking about here is this is more or less true. You know, when people are busy making money, you know, lawsuits tend to go down. People, they're not really at each other's throats, right? Because they're too busy being happy because they're making money, things are working in their favor, and so on and so forth. But I don't know that, I don't know where she doesn't cite her sources for elites noticing that they're I mean, of course, everybody's income went down. If the total economy goes down, the elites are certainly part of the economy, so their income goes down too. And so if there's stagflation and people are laid off and lost their jobs, the elites aren't making bonuses and stuff. I mean, you know, this is just common sense. That's why you want to have a healthy economy, an economy that's vibrant and is producing a lot. Hopefully so much that it can export a lot, right? We produce more than we need, and so we help the rest of the world get what they need, and they can buy it from us, and then we can even become more prosperous, right? But what she's saying here is that a group of people got together, these elites, okay, and they said, you know, our slice of the pie is going down. We need to figure out what we need to do to fix this problem. Now, what's interesting, and I do think this is true, this next part, she's going to talk about what these elites did. And this is another part that I think is a big problem within our government. Let's let her tell us what this is all about.
Profits were falling, and their relative economic power had been slipping.
And by the mid-1970s, business elites weren't just annoyed. They were in full-blown panic mode. But every crisis brings opportunities. And in the 1970s, the opportunity was to redesign the system in favour of those at the top. This had already been in the works for a while. If you've seen my Who Really Controls the Economy video, you will remember that business elites had already been building think tanks and launching propaganda campaigns for decades. If you want to understand the scale of all the propaganda efforts and want to understand all of the mechanisms of it on a deeper level, I highly recommend watching that one after this video. Anyways, up until the early 70s,
the people actually running government still mostly believed in embedded liberalism, the post-war idea that markets needed to be regulated and society needed to be protected.
By the early 1970s, business elites weren't just lobbying from the outside anymore.
They were starting to gain influence inside government and were ready to shape policy in their favour.
I wanted to interrupt the video shortly.
Okay, so we're gonna stop her video there, but I do want to talk about this because it's a very important observation. I think she assigns causality all wrong. I've talked about this before, where GE lobbied the U.S. government to outlaw the incandescent light bulb, and this is what she's getting at with this story. Okay, we're not going to play the rest of it because the show's running long today, and I want to wrap up. But what she's talking about is that corporations started to turn to government this is kind of effectively what they did is they turned to government to game the system in their favor. This is akin to getting to the top and then pulling up the ladder so that nobody else can compete with you. So what they did is they started to lobby the government to create a body of laws that protected them from competition, protected their revenue base, protected them from each other through acquisition and things like this. And this is not a characteristic of a free market. It's not free market to take one of your employees, turn them into a lobbyist, and see if you can go advantage your corporation by lobbying the government to create laws that advantage you. That's not free market. Okay? This is, if you go back to the very beginning and you see how she started talking about we had regulation and we still have all that. In fact, we have more of it than ever. Okay. And the reason we have more of it than ever is because of this phenomenon she's talking about. Corporations in the 70s and late 70s and 80s, they started to show up in Washington, D.C. a lot more frequently with some agenda that they wanted some congressman or some senator to carry out. Okay. That's more regulation. Okay. It's not like she kind of tells this story that Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher came in and deregulated everything and lowered taxes, and that's why there's inequality. No, there's inequality because of monetary funny business or monetary manipulation, monetary inflation, let's just call it that, and rigging the game in the particular corporation's favor. When I'm at GE and I send a lobbyist to go lobby Congress to outlaw the incandescent light bulb, okay, all the same time, I'm shutting down my incandescent light bulb factories in heartland of America and laying off the workers and setting up a deal to make the compact fluorescent light bulbs in China. That's not free market. Okay. That is GE using some of their resources that they earned in the market to influence government to put a moat around their business, a government created moat. Okay. This is akin to pulling up the ladder, getting to the top and pulling up the ladder so nobody else can have success. And yes, this is a huge part of inequality. Huge part of inequality. I would say it's secondary, but it has more to do with the lack of innovation. If you look at certain sectors, you'll see that there's not as much innovation as there is in other sectors. So if I go to government and I lobby the government to help me create barriers around my business that keeps competition away, that thwarts innovation. Okay. So that's why, in some sectors, we don't see as much innovation as we do in other sectors. That's why so much money is flowing into the tech sector and AI and stuff like that, because it's not controlled by the government. But that's changing. You can bet your bottom dollar that's going to change, because if AI becomes a reality and the government sees AI as a tool of control and social control and things like that, and a way to govern people more carefully, like they do in China. In China, if you get out of line with the government, like you say something against the government, you post something on social media that makes the government look bad, they just disappear you from the social credit system. They basically make it so that you can't do anything in the economy. You can't buy anything. You can't buy a train ticket. You can't leave. Some of these people in China are homeless now, not because of lack of economic prosperity and vibrance in their economy, but because they've been kicked to the curb in the economy. They've been excluded from the economy because the Chinese government has gotten so much control over the people that everything is done through their phone and through their identification, their face recognition, things like this. And they're implementing total control to the point where if you get on the wrong side of that, it's like Tom Bilyeu said, anytime you have socialism and, I have a plan and here's what we're all going to do, there's always going to be somebody that says, I disagree. I don't want to do that. I'm not interested in that plan. China has a solution for those people. okay, you can lose your job, lose your ability to earn any income, lose your ability to buy and sell, to participate in the transportation system, go live on the street. That's what they're doing. They're not throwing people in jail. They're just saying, well, we'll just take everything away from you and you can go live on the street. So, look, I mean, this is a good video. I think you should go watch it. But I want you to watch it and listen for these things that I'm talking about. These are causality challenges that she's having here. She's not connecting the dots. That's a good way to think about it. Connect the dots. She's not connecting the dots properly. She's looking for certain causality links, but to my point, you can always find some graph somewhere that correlates with your story. It doesn't mean that one caused the other. That's an economic fallacy that's very well known. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. I hope that was helpful. Maybe you could send that to somebody. Maybe it'll be helpful to them. Appreciate you coming in. Appreciate you listening. If you're listening and listening only, please go watch a video, like and subscribe. That'll help the algorithms generate more traffic to the YouTube channel. And then just keep listening. I mean, if you prefer to listen on a podcast or a podcatcher, by all means do that. That's what I do. I like doing that as well. So I totally relate to that. But come back in a few more days. We'll have another show for you on Who Gets to Decide. Thanks, everybody. Peace. I'm out.